Endless Hustle is presented by Routine. Routine helps you unlock optimal health and daily performance by leveraging AI, in-home testing, and the latest in digital health tools to create a completely personalized micronutrient formula full of vitamins, minerals, and specialty compounds precisely dosed for your body based on your unique DNA, blood tests, and lifestyle habits. Visit routine.co to join. All right, it's a fun day on the Endless Hustle today as I'm joined by new Emmy nominee, because I just saw Tom Brady congratulating you on social media. So congrats on that. Acclaimed filmmaker, a guy who gets to work with all my idols. I have to interview him. He gets to work with them. The one and only Gotham Chopra. Congratulations on the Emmy nomination. Congratulations on Lost in Sports. Things are good, right?
Things are very good. Yes, we're blessed. Thank you for all that. It's been quite a week, and it's a lot of fun.
All right, so let's start with Lost in Sports, because essentially what you're doing is you're investigating the craziest mysteries and craziest happenings in sports. Evander Holyfield's ear, the And One mixtapes, which I freaking love that because I grew up on those. Like, how do you dig into these stories? Walk me through the process.
The name of the company is Religion of Sports. And I've always just been, as much of a sports fan I'm a believer in that sports are mythic. Sports are a language. And so Lost in Sports is sort of like examining and uncovering the mythology of sports, right? Ben Baskin, our host, he's like the Indiana Jones, like going on these expeditions and archaeologically digging up and excavating these incredible stories. Like you said, Lost in Sports, which came out today. It's like one of those things that's like, oh yeah, like whatever happened. That's kind of like the idea. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that. We did, the first one was on this lost sort of film that the Cleveland Browns made called Masters of the Gridiron. And Cleveland Brown fans are like, oh yeah, like, oh, that was so crazy. Whatever happened to it? And so like Ben goes on these journeys basically to uncover and answer that question. And it's been a lot of fun. And like, I was just like on N1, it's been so much fun because we've been able to go work with Steph Curry a few years ago. And I remembered Steph talked about N1. And he was like one of those guys like, oh yeah, like whatever happened. And I'm like, we're doing a podcast on it. Steph, would you be on it? He was like, of course, I totally would be on that because I love that stuff. So he did it. I just sent it to him. He just acknowledged, like, I'm going to listen to this tonight and I'm going to post on it and stuff like that. So, it's just a lot of fun, which is like, that's when you're doing something right.
So I was obviously just geeking out over the N1 mixtape. So I played high school and college basketball, and I actually played in high school with Kobe Bryant, who I know you developed a friendship with, and obviously did news, which was amazing. Great job with that. But I grew up on those N1 mixtapes, and like the professor, like he was cooler than like any of the NBA players. Like the professor was the baddest ass on the planet. And so to be able to relive that, that's so cool, man. I love that you guys are investigating that.
Yeah, we're having a lot of fun. I mean, I'd say, Ben's great. I know they come from a very genuine place, like, like this fascination. I'm like I'm going to give away like one of my ideas here, but like, I've always been fascinated by, because now I live in LA, when Kirk Gibson hit, the sort of
the walk-off
run. Yeah. Like I've been around so many people like, oh, like I know the guy who has that ball. Nobody has that ball, or maybe, but like the legend that God created out of who caught that ball and what that ball meant and everything. And so again, you go back to sports, it's like there's these artifacts, there's these things that, relics, basically, if we're using the Religion of Sports language, that means something. It's just another baseball, right? But like that baseball, what it means to this city, to that fan base, etc., is really cool. And so that's sort of the idea always behind Religion of Sports. And of course, this podcast is to really like deconstruct and decode that.
So I want to walk you back to 2015. You launched Religion of Sports with two of the biggest names in sports and entertainment, Tom Brady and Michael Strahan. How does that begin? What does that meeting look like? Are you in a room with Brady on your left, Strahan on your right, shitting your pants? Like, what's happening here? Like, what's going on?
Far more of a hustle than that. Look, I grew up as a huge fan. I grew up in Boston, so I'm a big like Boston sports fan. I'm lamenting the loss of the Bruins losing last night in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I've just always believed like sports are this language. Sports are a thing. I grew up around it. So, and just like the passion for it. And so I had sort of become friendly with both of them independently. Michael as someone who's, retired, iconic Hall of Famer, but also in the world of broadcasting and media. So I kind of originally Religion of Sports started out as a show, like not unlike Lost in Sports, what we just talked about is like, I want to do a show that uncovers why people love sports so much, like what they mean. And so Michael, who's sort of in broadcasting, was like, yeah, I'd love to be a part of that. So it's like, okay, check, like go, Tom, like, hey, so I'm thinking about doing this thing. And, I had like a sizzle reel that we had created that I showed Tom because, the guy's like still playing football, but at the time he was still playing. He's like, okay, I get it. I love the idea. I live this. I'm still playing. I'm at the epicenter. I joke all the time, I've lived it as a fan, as a believer, Tom's lived it as a demigod.
Yep.
He's sitting at the epicenter of the faith. And so again, it was more of a trust thing. It wasn't like some business plan I put in front of anyone. It was like, hey, I want to do this. I'm passionate about it. And those guys were both like, yeah, I get it. I want to support it. Tell me how I can be helpful. So started as a show, and then over time it morphed into like, hey, I think we can do other stuff, because it's really an idea more than anything, sports as a religion. And both of them are just, like I said, they're believers. And so that's kind of how it started. And then of course it evolved and has really now become so many different things.
You'd mentioned the Bruins. I actually also host a show for the NHL. And that show is I talk to celebrities and tastemakers about hockey. So I had no idea. I knew you were a Boston guy, but oh my God, that's okay. Tell me about your Bruins memories and growing up a Bruins fan. I got to hear all of this.
I'm just, I grew up in Boston, and like as much as like the Celtics, amazing, especially in the 80s, the Red Sox first, the Patriots and their incredible, like now, 20 years run, but like they weren't always like that. But the Bruins, I think, are like the most sort of blue collar Boston team there is. And, I grew up at a time like they weren't really that, they were good. They were really good, but they weren't like Stanley Cup good, like the Montreal Canadiens, the rivalry, like that was essentially our reoccurring Stanley Cup. And so I grew up in an era of Cam Neely and, Craig Janney. And like, I went to a high school that was like, hockey was the thing. I didn't play, but Belmont Hill sent players on through, to the NHL, et cetera. So it was like a hockey culture that I grew up around, and Old Garden and stuff like that. And yeah, I fell in love with it. And to this day, I live and die as of like yesterday. Like, you could kind of see it coming with the Islanders. They're having a special season. They've been on a run, but like still, like you always, as much of a fan I am of pretty much every sport, there's nothing like the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's just like, so it's kind of like, it's that day after where you're kind of lamenting, there's a silver lining, because it's like, I also actually feel like, oh, I can like, I've been living the last couple of weeks by like, oh, like I got, especially on the West Coast, where you're like, oh, game's starting at 4:00. I got to wrap this up. But so now I can get on with my life, but still, it was a good team this year. It's just, I kind of had a feeling like it was going to happen to the Islanders. And if not, like the Tampa has been so good now for the last few years that it's like, I wasn't very confident going into that series. Had we even.
Your father is one of the most famous people on the planet.
Yeah.
Please tell me he's a hockey fan as well. Does Deepak love hockey? And how do we get him into hockey if not?
Nothing about, I don't even know if I've ever had a, hockey conversation with him. In general, he knows nothing about sports. Like he just, although I will say sort of what's interesting now is like so much of the world of sports, athletes are tapping into like what he's been talking about, human potential, obviously performance, mindfulness is a big topic amongst athletes, the zone, flow state, all of these things. So they're sort of merging, but like, no, he's never, he's one of those people, like when I was growing up, it was just like, why? Because, I would like, we'd lose to the Canadians and I would go into like a depression for like 2 weeks. He's like, oh my, like, why do you care so much about this thing? Which I've always actually said is like the origin of Religion of Sports, which is like, it's an answer to that question. Like, yeah, no, I will never, nobody on the Boston Bruins knows me, but like, you know, we live and die by this thing. And why do I care so much? Here, watch this. This will explain it. So that's sort of been the idea.
So here's the $1 million question. You've obviously done award-winning projects around basketball players and other athletes. Which hockey player would you make a doc about?
Well, I was very passively involved because some friends of mine in Boston were working on it and came out actually last year on Zdeno Chara. He's a legend and amazing and a great human being. So that, I've been trying to, like, we have this other series. I don't even know if I'm allowed to talk about this, but, Greatness Code, which won the Emmy. And, we're into a second season. And I definitely have a hockey player like high on my list for, that we're targeting, trying to get for it. So I don't know. I mean, hockey's it's a tough sport when it comes to, look, I love it. I watch all the games, etc. But it's been hard to crack into like the mainstream, right? And that's, I mean, amazing players, right? Like Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin. I mean, there's a handful of Bruins that I would sort of put in that category, Pasternak, et cetera. But it's just like getting to the mainstream. And that's partly what makes hockey great. It's like, it's not selling itself. It's for the purists. It's for the people who love it. And so I also don't want to like sabotage that.
Oh, I would love to see you make a film about Ray Bourque. I would love a Ray Bourque film.
Yep.
All right. So
I have a signed puck on my, from Bobby Orr, of course, on my desk at the office.
So cool. All right. I want to talk to you about Brady because he's obviously aging in reverse. He's become, arguably the most marketable athlete on the planet at this point. But his social media is such fire. And I'm so fascinated by this. How great, in your opinion, is Tom Brady's social media?
I mean, look, like he's been great on the field largely. I mean, he's amazing, et cetera, but it's also because of his teammates. He's got some great guys working with him on his social media, and I think have really helped, curate his voice. And I mean, it's very authentic. Like those are his ideas. A lot of them, are like him literally, typing out the captions and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's just like the handcuffs have come off, and that's not casting dispersions on my favorite team growing up, the Patriots. But it's just like he's at a different stage of his life right now. And I think he's having a lot of fun and you can feel it. And that's, what makes social media work is authenticity. And so he's really like leaned into it, enjoying it, and has some great people around him, I think have a lot of fun.
And by the way, it's made him so much more likable and endeared him to a whole new generation of fans. It's incredible because I was thinking about this knowing I was interviewing you today. I don't know that there's ever been an athlete that has hit multiple generations and had such a switch from a guy that almost everybody disliked because of his success to now he's so beloved because of his success. Yeah. And I don't know if it's the team switch that caused it, but he really has become so beloved at this point.
Look, he's also, I mean, unlike I can't even think of anybody who's going. Did I see him like post something yesterday about year 22? It's like, oh my God, like, so he's and he talks about it a lot. We're working on something new. And he says, I went from like my teammates were my brothers to like, I was kind of a father figure to like, I think I'm kind of a grandfather figure to some of these guys who are coming into the league. And so he touches different generations. I think, he's relatable, obviously, in some ways to his teammates as an athlete. He's also a dad now, and his social media, he talks a lot about that. He posts a lot about that, So, yeah, I think he's relatable. It's interesting, too, because, like, look, I think so much of our success on our series going back a couple of years ago, Tom versus Time, was actually the opposite, right? Like, he wasn't on social media. There was a level of scarcity around him that suddenly like he's making a smoothie in his kitchen and it was like, holy, crap, like this is so amazing. And like, like really not, but like it was just like this level of access and, I think intimacy. Now, like you wouldn't be able to do that, frankly, right now, because now it's like so familiar and you feel, I mean, it's the, it is the phenomena of social media. So he's one of those rare athletes that I think like operates on two. He's got a Jordan-esque like, halo around him, his accomplishments, et cetera, celebrity and fame. But he's also now got this almost like, groundedness through his social media. So that's pretty unique, I think, that's out there.
You'd mentioned father, and I want to talk to you about your father, because growing up, your father, again, I'd mentioned, incredibly famous, incredibly influential. As you're growing up, do you have any understanding of your father's fame and influence, or is he just dad to you?
Well, my dad's fame really came in the early 90s, I would say, early to mid 90s. So I was a teenager, I was, and I, so I, and I was very familiar because my dad wasn't always, now what he's known for. Like his professional, I guess, transformation was really the function of a personal transformation. He was somebody who lived a very toxic lifestyle prior to like it was actually late 80s. The fame came in the 90s, but like his transformation started to happen in the 80s. And so, yeah, I remember like those days. I remember before, I remember during, and I remember after. And I think the timing actually was good for me because I had left for college, I think, like when it really started to explode. He was like on the Oprah Winfrey show, and all of a sudden, like I think that really like shined a spotlight on him. But I think for me, it was always like the fame was a sort of function of something deeper. And that's the part I remember. And I think, I've sort of like have a level of respect is weird. But it still does, like, I think probably now, like, oh yeah, he's this way to the world. And then, especially now, look, he's a grandfather, I have kids, and we see him as that, so there's that sort of dichotomy.
So when you start in the business, does your last name open up any doors, or is it a pure hustle? And how do you begin to break in with these guys? I mean, the access you have is unprecedented. How does it begin for you? How do you open those doors?
Well, I mean, yes, for sure. But before I started getting into sports, you mentioned Kobe. I'd say Kobe was like the first, prominent or athlete of that level that I ever worked with. That was like later into my career. It started as a reporter. I worked for a company called Channel One. And yeah, I think I got hired pretty much because of my last name. I mean, I'm not, like I don't try to sort of ignore that. But, I would say like I'm one of those people like, okay, I got in because of that. Now I got to prove myself. And I almost like I have to separate myself from that. So when I started working at Channel One, where I think there was like this, oh, like you're Deepak Chopra's son, so maybe we're gonna like do this sort of more new agey spiritual thing. And I was like, no, I actually want to go cover war zones. So I traveled for years to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, Colombia, like all these crazy places, the Middle East, and really covered like violence and war, because for me that was a way of like proving myself and differentiating myself. So I think one, I gained a lot of experience. I sort of obviously a lot of skill set in terms of filmmaking and storytelling. But then coming back around to like this stuff, I mean, yeah, I do think it helps. Like people, I mean, going back to Kobe and others who are, I don't know that they were fans of my dad, but they were familiar, or they could, Google it and figure it out. And I think there was a level of like, oh, you've grown up around this type of fame. You've been around not just your dad, but then your Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson and like all these people that he was, Michael was in particular. I remember Kobe saying, he's like, man, if that guy could trust you, I can trust you. And so like, and then that's always been like, well, if Kobe can trust you, like, then Tom's like, oh yeah, man, I can trust you. And if Tom can trust you, Steph Curry can trust you, and so on and so forth. So
yeah, it's funny, the Kobe stuff, because knowing him and remembering him from high school, and I always have this great Kobe story that we played in a summer league together, and I was just shooting the shit out of the ball in a game, just crushing it. And we ended up beating his team in a summer league game. So I came up afterwards and I go, great game. And his response was, you need to raise your shot release because you're going to get blocked at the next level. And I'm literally like, this guy didn't say great game back. His mind was always focused on improvement and the next steps. And then to see what he was able to build through his career, it really translated. And then I just had Tim Grover, his longtime trainer, on the show, who also trained Michael Jordan and then went to Kobe. And when I saw him use, that was really the first time, I feel like, that we got to see a different Kobe. Obviously, the family Kobe. You gained an access to him that we had never really seen that side of him. Obviously, we got to see the ruthlessness and the rehab and all that stuff. But also we got to see the softer, curious side. And it was nice to see people discover that Kobe wasn't just a stone cold assassin all the time.
Yeah. I mean, look, and those things are a function of a relationship and where you end up in, day with Kobe. I think it went on for several years in terms of like the project and filming and the relationship, but it's not where you start on day one. It just isn't, it's like, and I always joke, like you always have those early conversations in these projects. And it's usually with like Kobe and Vanessa, Tom and Giselle, Steph and Aisha. It's like, or here's our boundaries. But you get to a point at the end where it's like, you're getting text from Aisha or, Giselle. It's like, hey, kids' graduation is on Monday. And like, I think we're going to have a party. You should come. It'd be really fun. We should capture some of that. And so it's, I think that's kind of where you want to get. And that, by the way, that's like, not then, oh, great, we can stick it in the documentary and like show it to the world. I mean, a lot of what you film doesn't end up, on screen. It's like anything, it's memories. Like you want to like be able to capture that. And so that's, it's a relationship and you got to invest in them and be patient. And, and Kobe, that was, special for sure.
How difficult is it? Because when you become friends with the subjects, I'm sure you want to protect them. You don't want to do anything to tarnish their image. I'm sure there's moments that are being recorded that aren't the most flattering. But then on the other hand, you want to really do the project justice. How do you walk that fine line to make sure that the project really reflects what you want it to reflect while not violating your friendship?
Yeah, well, again, like I mean, while I was a reporter in my when I started out, like I'm not a reporter. I'm a storyteller. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a collaborator. So, these things take time because relationships take time and you build a trust. And, I've been fortunate also to work with like really smart people. Kobe, being as smart as anyone I've worked with and him understanding, oh, if you want this to be good, it has to be honest. Like, it has to be real. You have to go to those places. You have to be vulnerable. Like, look, we all have the same goal, which is to create something really great and memorable and iconic. To do that, it can't be just like some puff piece. It can't be some vanity piece. And I think Kobe in particular really understood that. And so giving the access, talking about the things in his life, the dark places that he's been and the things he regrets, et cetera, was really important. And so, but, and I mean, Kobe's like, I remember we'd be working, he's like, oh man, like, so I got to be like 100% honest. And we're like, yeah, 80 to 85% honest. Like, we got boundaries, your dad, like, so sort of thing. I mean, we joked about that, but look, it's a thing. You got to figure it out together. Like, okay, like this needs to be addressed. How are we going to do it? And in his case, like, it was like lots of legal issues and stuff like that also. So it's not simply like, oh, we're just going to figure it out together, so it's a process, and you make choices and then you make choices and some of them aren't, in hindsight, like the best choices. And so, it's just all part of how the sausage gets made.
You have a project about to come out later this summer with Simone Biles, who, of all the athletes we've talked about, Simone might end up going down as the most accomplished of them all. And that says a lot when Tom Brady's in your company. Working with Simone Biles, you've got to tell me about that. I've interviewed her many times. First of all, it always strikes me how tiny she is. And to be able to see athletically what she's able to do is just mind-blowing. But as you worked with her, what did you learn about her and get to see that we're going to discover through this new project?
Yeah, I always say, she's the goatiest of the goats I've ever worked with. I mean, she's a superhero. She literally is a superhero. And with all due respect to Tom and Steph and Kobe and everything, I've never seen anyone. It's interesting that you talked about her size, because the only person I feel like I've been around, worked, and I don't really know him that well, but I've worked a little bit with him, is LeBron, because physically you're like, are we the same species when you're around him? She's kind of the same thing, but like, they were like diametrically different in terms of size, but what she can do, like what she does on the vault and the beam and the floor and all that sort of stuff is like unbelievable. And then, going back to superheroes, like her story, like when I'm familiar, obviously, like with, some of the trauma, like as a survivor she's been through, like through the Larry Nassar scandal and stuff like that. I don't think I knew really about her upbringing in the foster care system and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's like, if you wrote this thing, you'd be like, oh yeah, like writing, Superman or whatever, like it's like a fictional thing, but it's like, oh no, it's real. Like it is crazy real what she has overcome and what she's sort of carrying with her when she gets out onto that stage. So I think I was just blown away, frankly, about, and also her willingness to go there, having just talked about like, okay, you got to figure out all these things and how are you going to talk about it and what's the right amount. Simone's like sort of processing it in real time. She's very candid about that. She's, she talks about her mental health and her mental health struggles and her mental health treatment. And so she just like lays it out there. Like, there's no like discussion of like how we're going to do this. It's just like, boom, it's right there. And I've been fortunate on that one in particular to like just have this incredible team of women, and that was purposeful. Like just a team of, an amazing cinematographer and Jessica Young, Katie Walsh, this producer I'm working with, who, are women who can make Simone feel comfortable with that vulnerability and stuff like that and really be with her. Part of like what I've been able to do through the years with Kobe and Steph and Tom, et cetera, is like have that intimacy. I'm like in their houses, in their cars, like in the locker room, things that I couldn't and probably shouldn't do with Simone, considering, I mean, she's a young woman, but also that she's, been through all this trauma. So I was really lucky to have this team that could build that type of intimacy with her, and make her comfortable. And then, like I said, she just laid it all out there. And so I would say this series, Simone versus herself, is as good as anything we've ever produced. I mean, I say that probably sounds arrogant, but like, just because of, frankly, who she is.
You'd mentioned Steph multiple times. And I, as a Philly boy, I grew up during the era of Allen Iverson.
Yeah.
And there was really nobody cooler. Like there just wasn't. Yeah. You could show up at a TGIF Fridays on City Avenue. He'd be there. His Bentley would be there eating chicken fingers inside. I mean, he was this enigma, but the most beloved athlete, probably, and influential of a generation of for a sport. Curry is that guy now. When you see what he's done for the game and also how players emulate him, it's fascinating. Do you think Steph has an understanding of his influence on this generation of NBA players?
Look, I think that Steph is still in it. I have an interesting anecdote. Like when I was working with him a couple of years ago, I'm a basketball junkie, right? Like it sounds like you are. And so we were talking about like top 5 players of all time and stuff like that, top 10. And, Steph was going through it and he was like thinking a lot about it. And he put LeBron in it and he didn't put himself in it. And I was like, so where do you belong in this, Bill Russell and MJ, of course, and LeBron? And Steph was like, I don't know. I can't think about that. Like, I don't think about that while I'm in it. So I think he would have a hard time. I think he's very aware. I mean, I think he takes very seriously the role model aspect. He knows how popular he is, especially with kids and stuff like that. And I'm not even sure in a basketball sense, in terms of like healthy living and, being a role model, being a good person, all that stuff. I think in that way but I don't know, like, but I'm not sure Allen Iverson did at the time too. Like, that's the point. It's like, they're just being who they are. And, like that, there's not much of an agenda really behind it. I think over time, Steph, especially, because he's really smart and he's really successful, he'll embrace that role, but I think he's still sort of in it. He still wants to beat everybody, like, so it's hard for him to, like, when you hear things like John Morant saying, "Oh, I grew up like watching Steph Curry and I idolized him." Steph's like, "Cool, but I got to play him next week." Like,
Right,
I want
right.
to.
I'm still in the league, buddy.
Yeah.
I'm still an all-star.
But I hear you on Allen Iverson. I mean, you're talking to a Boston kid, and like somehow Allen Iverson was my favorite player, even though I hated the Sixers. And
Yep.
and I just did. Somebody tell me the other day, I saw posted, like, it's been 25 years since Allen did the step over, in against LA. I was like, wow, like
It's like feels like yesterday.
yeah,
I'm a lifelong Lakers fan, so I grew up loving Showtime,
uh-huh,
and I remember that moment. And he was just a definition of cool. He
yeah.
was cool without trying to be cool. It was amazing.
When we worked on this project a couple of years ago, Shut Up and Dribble with LeBron, it was interesting. Literally, everyone of that era, like our age, basically, from Jay-Z to obviously every player, they talked about Allen Iverson was the most culturally LeBron, Maverick Carter, all of them said it's Allen who, like, changed the way everything. We played on the court, we dressed off the court, we talked about ourselves. We embraced our, cultural identity, etc. And, I interviewed, the late David Stern, and he was like, tell me when the camera goes on, I'll tell you some, tell me when the camera goes off, then I'll really tell you some great Allen stories. And so, just iconic, culturally defining.
When you develop these friendships with these guys and girls, is there an expectation? And I know you can't say, "Hey, person X, we're going to make a project about you one day." But do you, as soon as you become friends with them, do you start molding a narrative in your head around, like let's call it a Steph Curry, where you're like, in 10 years, I would love to tell this story about Steph Curry? Like, is that the way your mind works?
A little bit. I mean, I think that, like, obviously the interesting thing with NBA players, NFL players, Serena Williams, et cetera, is like there's a public narrative. There's like, we already kind of think we know the story because they're like on TV every day or on social media every day, or I follow them and I feel like I know them. I already have some perception of them. And then I think, yeah, once you start to meet them and you get to know them and you get to see their family, you start like, oh, that's interesting because I totally wouldn't have thought that. Or, you start to feel this gulf between like the public perception and then the private, intimate thing. And I think so much of storytelling, like when we do these things, we use the media narrative so much, like those voices, that are constantly coming, on sports radio or ESPN or all the punditry, et cetera, all the now podcasts and stuff. So yeah, I think like a lot of storytelling just exists in that friction between like the public and private narrative. And you start to like notice those things and catalog those things for sure.
Even though you grew up around the likes of Michael Jackson, and we're talking the fame of fame, the apex of fame, but do you ever kind of take a step back as a middle-aged man right now and think to yourself, holy shit, look at the people I get to associate with and work with?
Yeah, for sure. I still, people ask me all the time, like, oh, so do you still like enjoy like, sports? Like, can you? I'm like, yeah, like I will be watching. I don't even care. Like, I'm not a Clippers fan, but I'll be watching tonight. Like, the Clippers and the Jazz. Like, I don't even really like the Jazz, but like, I love watching. I love sports. Because to me, sports are mythic and sports are about human potential. And I do separate. Like, I've gotten to know a lot of these athletes, and so like, I have a 13-year-old son. I'm like, hey, absolutely, you should admire like the commitment that goes into like, achieving this sort of greatness and elite performance. But you don't know these people, and you got to be careful about that also. And they're human beings, and they make mistakes, and they do things that aren't great. And so yeah, I think I've been able to sort of like straddle that and still very much like enjoy and just like, I love competition. I love just like watching it and pulling it apart and understanding it. So Yeah, I think, I had a moment, this is going back a few years. And now, I mean, like my relationship with Tom has really, gotten a lot closer. But I remember at the time, I was working on Tom versus Time with him, and it really followed him across the whole season. So like, it was pretty, close to him. And I was driving with him to the AFC Championship. And I kind of like, I told him, I'm like, dude, I never do this, but I have to do this. Like, because 12-year-old Gotham cannot believe she's riding to the AFC Championship, Patriots with Tom Brady. So we're going to take a selfie. And like, and, he was cool about it too, because I think that's one of the things I've been lucky with, like Tom and Steph in particular, is like, they realize that. Like, Tom's the guy who like grew up watching, Joe Montana and Steve Young and dreaming of this. And he doesn't take it for granted. He's kind of the guy who's like, can you believe this like is happening? And so I think there's a humility there. Steph is the same way. I mean, he grew up like, with his dad, Del Curry, and like dreaming of doing that. And then it happened. And, and his brother's in the league and his brother-in-law's in the league and stuff. And he's like, can you believe this is happening? And so I think, I've also like seen that and felt that.
So cool. So one of the reasons that I started this show, Gotham, was to talk to successful people like you about how you achieve your success. So my question to you, Gotham Chopra, what do you do to continue to elevate in your own life?
It's a great question. Look, I think what we were just talking about, I try to just humility. Like, I love this. I love this, and I get to do it for. And so those little things that, come up and that are annoying and exhausting and everything, I remind myself, like, yeah, but I dreamt of this, and I get to do it for a living now. And so I think that healthy humility is really good. I also think like I try to find life away from work. I've become a lot healthier, I'd say, just in my lifestyle, emotionally, physically, certainly mentally. And so I find balance, and I think that's really important. I've definitely noticed like, oh, like Tom Brady, like, how does he do this? How's he continuing to do this? It's not just like he's studying film all the time or doing pliability. He's found balance. He's good about his diet. He's good about his sleep. He's good about, and the more, the older you get, the more you realize like how important that is. And so I really sort of found a way to make that a part of my practice or my lifestyle.
Dude, this has been awesome. Congratulations on the Emmy nomination. Lost in Sports is out. Simone Biles right behind it. And I love what you, Strahan, and Brady have built with Religion in Sports. Just awesome. Religion of Sports is just awesome in my mind. I love what you guys are doing with it.
I appreciate that so much. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and thanks for doing it.
Awesome, man. Congrats on everything. Thank you so much, Gotham.
All right.
Take care, man.